In the heart of a city that never slept, with a clatter of horse-drawn carriages mingled with the roar of the first automobiles, and the shadow of newfangled skyscrapers stretched long over cobblestone streets, a secret was buried. Not in the earth, but in the very fabric of time itself. It was a secret that could unravel the dawn of the American century, a secret known only to a reclusive horologist named Alastair Finch. And as the great clock on the Metropolitan Life Tower chimed to welcome the year 1908, Alastair knew his time was running out. He'd seen the future, not in a crystal ball or a fevered dream, but in the intricate dance of gears and springs of a pocket watch that did not merely tell time, but held it captive. And what he saw was a catastrophe that would rewrite history, a disaster so profound it would make the great San Francisco earthquake seem but a tremor. He had to stop it, but in a world on the cusp of a new era, a world enamored with progress and deaf to warnings of the past, who would believe a mad clockmaker's prophecy? His only hope lay in a most unlikely alliance, a street-smart grifter with a silver tongue, a trailblazing female journalist who chased truth with the tenacity of a bulldog, and a skeptical physics professor who believed in logic, not legends. Together, they would have to race against the relentless ticking of a clock that was not just counting down the hours, but the very seconds of their existence, to a moment when the future would be unmade. The question was not if they could succeed, but what they would be willing to sacrifice in the unforgiving crucible of time. The biting January wind whipped around the corners of Alastair Finch's small, cluttered workshop on the Lower East Side, a cacophony of ticking and talking from 100 different timepieces serving as the only constant in his life. The horologist, a man whose age was as indeterminate as the dust motes dancing in the slivers of gaslight, hunched over a workbench littered with brass gears, delicate springs, and lenses of varying magnifications. His fingers, though gnarled with age, moved with the precision of a surgeon as he adjusted the intricate mechanism of the device that was both his greatest creation and his most terrible burden. It was a pocket watch, yet to call it such was to call a thunderstorm a summer shower. The casing was fashioned from a meteorite, its silvery surface etched with celestial patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering light. The face was not of porcelain or enamel, but of a polished, obsidian-like stone, with hands that did not merely sweep across the hours, but seemed to pull the very moments along with them. This was the chronometer, and it did not just tell time, it showed it. Alastair had stumbled upon the properties of the meteoritic alloy by accident, a chance discovery that had consumed the past 2 decades of his life. The metal, when forged and fashioned into the precise configuration of gears and springs he had envisioned, resonated with the subtle vibrations of the temporal stream, allowing glimpses into the currents of what was to come. For years, the visions had been fleeting, fragmented. A horse winning a race, a sudden drop in the stock market, the face of a stranger he would meet the next day. But lately, the chronometer had been screaming. It showed him a New York City of the near future, a city of even grander ambitions, of towers that pierced the clouds and horseless carriages that zipped along elevated highways. But this gleaming metropolis was built on a foundation of ash. The chronometer showed him fire, a conflagration that would dwarf the Great Fire of Chicago, a blaze that would start in the city's heart and spread with unnatural speed, consuming everything in its path. He showed him a date, October 30th, 1908, and he showed him a cause, not an accident, but a deliberate act of sabotage, a spark ignited by a shadowy cabal with a lust for power and a disregard for human life. He had tried to warn the authorities, but his frantic letters to the police commissioner and the mayor's office had been met with stony silence, his visits to the local precinct earning him little more than a pitying smile and a suggestion that he get some rest. They saw him as a mad old man, a purveyor of fantastical tales. He needed help. He needed people who could see beyond the veil of the ordinary, people who were not afraid to challenge the established order. And so, with a heavy heart
and a hand that trembled with the weight of his knowledge, Alistair Finch had set in motion a plan to assemble his unlikely team. His first target was a man known in the saloons and gambling dens of the Bowery as Silas the Silver-Tongued. Silas was a grifter, a conman, a charlatan with a disarming smile and a knack for getting himself into and out of trouble. But beneath the polished veneer of a scoundrel, Alistair had seen a sharp mind and a moral compass that, while occasionally pointing south, was not entirely broken. Silas knew the city's underbelly, the secret societies and the back-alley deals that were the true currency of power in New York. The second was Eleanor Nellie Bly, a name that was already becoming a legend in the world of journalism. She was a woman who had feigned insanity to expose the horrors of a mental asylum, who had circled the globe in a record-breaking 72 days. Nellie was a seeker of truth, a bulldog who would sink her teeth into a story and not let go until she had shaken every last secret from it. She had the ear of the public, the power to make people listen. The final piece of his puzzle was Professor Julian Croft, a brilliant but deeply skeptical physics professor at Columbia University. Croft was a man of science, a believer in the immutable laws of the universe. He dealt in facts and figures, in theories that could be proven with equations and experiments. The idea of a watch that could see the future would be an anathema to him, an affront to everything he held dear. But Alistair knew that if he could convince Croft, if he could show him the impossible, then the professor's scientific mind would be an invaluable asset in unraveling the how of the impending disaster.
And so, as the city around him slumbered, oblivious to the storm gathering on the horizon, Alistair Finch penned 3 letters, each a carefully crafted invitation to a meeting that would change the course of their lives, and perhaps the course of history itself. The letters were dispatched by a trusted messenger, a young boy from the neighborhood, to whom Alistair had always been kind. The bait was laid. Now all he could do was wait and pray that the fish would bite. The first to arrive at Alistair's dusty workshop was Silas, drawn by the promise of a once-in-a-lifetime proposition and the tantalizing hint of a substantial reward. He was a man in his late 20s, with a head of unruly dark hair, a twinkle in his eye, and a suit that was just a little too flashy to be entirely respectable. He navigated the labyrinth of ticking clocks with a practiced ease, his gaze darting around the room, assessing the value of everything he saw. "Mr. Finch, I presume," Silas said, his voice as smooth as aged whiskey. "Silas Blackwood. You wrote to me about a business opportunity. I must say, your letter was intriguing." Before Alistair could reply, the bell above the door chimed again, and in walked Nellie Bly. She was a woman of striking intelligence, her sharp, observant eyes taking in every detail of the cluttered shop. She was dressed in a practical, tailor-made suit, a clear statement of her no-nonsense approach to her profession. "Alistair Finch," she asked, her tone direct and to the point. "I'm Nellie Bly. Your letter mentioned a story that could shake the very foundations of this city. I'm here to find out if you're a madman or a visionary." The final guest arrived a few minutes later, a man who seemed entirely out of place in the chaotic workshop. Professor Julian Croft was in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard, spectacles perched on his nose, and an air of academic authority. He clutched a leather-bound briefcase to his chest as if it were a shield, his expression a mixture of curiosity and deep-seated skepticism. "Mr. Finch," he began, his voice dry and precise, "your letter made a series of rather extraordinary claims. As a man of science, I am compelled to investigate, though I must confess I expect to be thoroughly disappointed." Alistair gestured for them to gather around his workbench.
With a sense of theatricality that belied his reclusive nature, he unveiled the chronometer. He explained its origins, its peculiar properties, and the terrible vision it had shown him of the city's fiery demise. Silas, ever the opportunist, saw the potential for a grand swindle. Nellie, the intrepid reporter, scented the story of a lifetime. And Croft, the man of science and logic, found himself captivated by the impossible object before him, his skepticism warring with a nascent sense of wonder. The old horologist then played his masterstroke. He asked each of them for a personal object, something of sentimental value. Silas offered a silver dollar he had won in a poker game, Nellie a fountain pen that had been a gift from her mentor, and Croft, after a moment's hesitation, a locket containing a miniature portrait of his late wife. One by one, Alistair placed the objects on the face of the chronometer. As each item touched the strange, dark stone, the hands of the watch began to spin wildly, and the air around it grew cold. Then, on the polished surface of the obsidian, images began to form, visions from the past, present, and future of each of the three visitors. Silas saw a fleeting image of his estranged younger sister, her face etched with a fear he had never seen before. Nellie witnessed a shadowy figure planting a device in the basement of a building she did not recognize. And Croft, to his utter astonishment, saw a vision of his wife, not as she was in the locket, but as she would have been had she lived, older, her face lined with laughter, a future that had been stolen from him by a cruel twist of fate. The visions lasted only a few moments, but they were enough. Silas's cynical facade crumbled, replaced by a flicker of genuine concern. Nellie's journalistic instincts went into overdrive, and Croft, the man of logic and reason, was forced to confront a reality that defied every principle he held sacred.
"I don't know how you did that, old man," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, "but you have my attention." "This cabal you spoke of," Nellie pressed, her pen already poised over her notepad. "Who are they? What do they want?" Croft, still shaken by the vision of his wife, simply pushed his spectacles up the bridge of his nose and said, "Tell us everything, Mr. Finch, and I mean everything." The unlikely alliance was forged. The Grifter, the journalist, the professor, and the mad Clockmaker, bound together by a shared purpose, to save a city that was blissfully unaware of its own impending doom. Their race against time had begun. The first step was to identify the shadowy cabal that Alistair had seen in his visions. The chronometer had shown him glimpses of their meetings, held in opulent, wood-paneled rooms, their faces obscured by shadows. But one detail had stood out, a distinctive signet ring worn by one of the members, a serpent devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros. Silas, with his intimate knowledge of the city's secret societies, recognized the symbol immediately. "The serpent's hand," he said, a note of unease in his voice. "They're more than just a secret society. They're a cult. They believe in creative destruction, in tearing down the old to make way for the new, and they have a lot of powerful friends in this city." Nellie, using her press credentials, began to dig into the city's financial records, looking for any unusual activity, any sudden shifts in wealth or power. She spent hours in the dusty archives of the New York Public Library, poring over old newspapers and public records, searching for any mention of the Serpent's hand. Meanwhile, Professor Croft, armed with the knowledge of the impending disaster, began to work on a way to counter it. He theorized that the fire Alistair had seen was not a normal conflagration, but something accelerated,
something fueled by a chemical agent that burned hotter and faster than anything known to science. He set up a makeshift laboratory in the back of Alistair's workshop, a strange juxtaposition of modern scientific equipment and ancient timepieces. Alistair, for his part, continued to consult the chronometer, trying to glean more details about the Cabal's plan. The visions were often fragmented and difficult to interpret, but slowly a clearer picture began to emerge. He saw a map of the city with a series of locations marked with the Serpent symbol. He saw a man with a scarred face, a chemist with a reputation for creating exotic explosives, and he saw a date circled in red on a calendar, October 30th, the night before Halloween, a night when the city would be distracted by revelry and mischief. Their investigation led them down a rabbit hole of corporate espionage, political corruption, and dark occult rituals. They discovered that the Serpent's Hand was led by a charismatic and ruthless industrialist named Thaddeus Blackwood, a man who believed that New York City had become decadent and corrupt, and that it needed to be purged by fire to be reborn. And in a shocking twist, Silas discovered that Thaddeus Blackwood was his own estranged uncle, the man who had disowned his family and driven them into poverty. The personal and the professional had collided, and the stakes were now higher than ever. Silas, who had always lived by a code of self-preservation, now found himself fighting for something more than just his own survival. He was fighting for his family, for his city, and for the chance to redeem a past that had haunted him for years. As they delved deeper, they found themselves being hunted. They were followed, their apartments were ransacked, and they received anonymous threats. The Serpent's Hand was aware of their investigation, and they would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. One evening, as Nellie was working late in her office at the New York World, she was attacked by a thuggish-looking man who warned her to drop her investigation. But Nellie was not a woman to be intimidated. She fought back with a ferocity that surprised her attacker, and he fled into the night, leaving behind a small but crucial clue: a matchbook from an exclusive gentlemen's club, the Olympian Club, a known haunt of the city's elite. Using the matchbook as their lead, Silas, a master of disguise, infiltrated the Olympian Club, posing as a wealthy out-of-town businessman. He charmed his way into the inner circle of the club's members, and through a series of carefully orchestrated conversations, he learned that the Serpent's Hand was planning a special event on the night of October 30th, a grand illumination that would light up the city like never before. Meanwhile, Professor Croft, working with the fragmented visions from the chronometer, had made a breakthrough. He had identified the chemical accelerant that the Serpent's Hand planned to use, a volatile compound of his own creation, an experimental formula that had been stolen from his university laboratory months earlier. The irony was not lost on him. The very tool of his scientific inquiry had been twisted into a weapon of mass destruction.
With the date and the method of the attack now known, the team raced against time to find the locations that Alistair had seen marked on the map. They were key points in the city's infrastructure: a major subway junction, a gas works, a power station, and the newly constructed Singer Building, the tallest building in the world. The Serpent's Hand planned to plant their incendiary devices at these locations, creating a chain reaction that would engulf the entire city in a firestorm. The night of October 30th arrived, a night of eerie fog and a palpable sense of foreboding. The city was alive with the sounds of Halloween celebrations, the streets filled with costumed revelers, their laughter and merrymaking a stark contrast to the grim task that lay ahead for our heroes. They split up, each with a specific target. Nellie, using her press pass to gain access to the Singer Building, went to disarm the device planted in its basement.
Silas, using his knowledge of the city's underbelly, navigated the labyrinthian tunnels of the subway system to reach the junction. And Professor Croft, with a satchel of scientific equipment, headed for the gasworks, the most volatile of all the targets. Alistair remained in his workshop, his hand on the chronometer, his mind a conduit for the swirling currents of time, guiding his friends through the dangers that lay ahead. The final confrontation was a symphony of chaos and heroism. Nellie found herself in a tense standoff with the scarred chemist, a man who was as fanatical as he was brilliant. Silas had to outwit a team of heavily armed guards in the dark, damp tunnels of the subway system, and Croft had to use all of his scientific knowledge to neutralize the chemical accelerant without setting off a catastrophic explosion. In the end, it was not brute force, but their unique skills and their unwavering trust in each other that saved the day. Nellie, with her quick thinking and her knowledge of human nature, managed to talk the chemist down, appealing to the spark of humanity that still remained within him. Silas, with his silver tongue and his ability to think on his feet, created a diversion that allowed him to disarm the device and escape unscathed. And Croft, with his calm, methodical approach, successfully neutralized the threat at the gasworks, averting a disaster of unimaginable proportions. As the first light of dawn broke over the city, the four heroes, exhausted but triumphant, gathered once more in Alistair's workshop. The city was safe, the Serpent's hand was exposed, and Thaddeus Blackwood, his grand vision of a fiery rebirth reduced to ashes, was taken into custody. But the victory was not without its costs. Alistair, the strain of using the chronometer having taken its toll, passed away peacefully in his sleep a few days later, his final vision a peaceful and prosperous future for the city he had saved. Silas, having confronted the demons of his past, decided to use his talents for good, becoming a private investigator who specialized in helping those who had been wronged by the rich and powerful. Nellie Bly wrote The Story of a Lifetime, an exposé that rocked the city to its core and cemented her reputation as one of the greatest journalists of her generation. And Professor Croft, his faith in the rational world shaken but not broken, dedicated his life to the study of the strange and unexplained, forever changed by his glimpse into the mysteries of time. The chronometer, its purpose served, when silent, its celestial patterns no longer shifting, its hands frozen at the moment of the city's salvation. It remained in the possession of the unlikely heroes, a silent testament to their courage, their sacrifice, and the enduring power of the human spirit to defy the darkness and shape its own destiny. And as the years went by, and the city of New York grew and prospered, few would ever know of the disaster that was averted, of the four people who stood against the tide of history and changed its course forever. Their story, like so many others in the city that never sleeps, was lost to the mists of time. A secret whispered only by the ticking of 1,000 clocks in a dusty old workshop on the Lower East Side.
4 years had passed. The Gilded Age had given way to the Progressive Era, a time of trust-busting, social reform, and boundless technological optimism. The city of New York, saved from a fiery apocalypse it never knew was coming, had continued its relentless march into the future. Skyscrapers, each taller and more audacious than the last, clawed at the clouds. The cacophony of the automobile was now a permanent fixture in the city's symphony. For most New Yorkers, the autumn of 1908 was a fading memory, a footnote in the city's sprawling epic. But for 3 individuals, the memory was as vivid as a fresh wound, a shared secret that bound them in an unspoken fraternity of the impossible. Silas Blackwood, the silver-tongued grifter, had channeled his considerable talents into a burgeoning career as a private investigator. His office, a modest affair in the shadow of the Flatiron Building, was a haven for the desperate and the disenfranchised. He had found a semblance of purpose, using his street smarts not to swindle but to serve. Yet there were nights when the old life whispered to him, when the thrill of the con felt more real than the quiet satisfaction of a case closed. The name Blackwood, once a source of shame, was now his own, redeemed through his actions,
though the shadow of his uncle Thaddeus, languishing in a federal prison, was never far from his mind. Nellie Bly, her fame now stratospheric after her exposé on the Serpent's hand, had become one of the most powerful voices in American journalism. She had her own syndicated column, a platform from which she championed the cause of the underdog and held the powerful to account. She had traveled the world, interviewed presidents and kings, and yet no story had ever matched the terrifying, exhilarating thrill of that single night in October. She had chased the truth and found it, but in doing so, had glimpsed a reality so far beyond the ken of her readers that she could never fully report it. It was a story trapped within her, a silent, heavy stone in the river of her life. And then there was Professor Julian Croft. The events of 1908 had shattered his neatly ordered world of logic and reason. He had continued his work at Columbia, a respected, if somewhat eccentric, figure in the world of physics. But his true passion, his obsession, lay hidden in a lead-lined room in the basement of his brownstone on the Upper West Side. There, on a velvet cushion under a glass cloche, lay the chronometer. Alistair Finch had bequeathed it to them jointly, but by unspoken agreement, Croft had become its custodian. He had spent 4 years studying it, trying to understand the science behind its impossible power, to codify the miraculous. He had measured its energy output, analyzed its strange alloy, and filled countless notebooks with equations and theories that bordered on the heretical. But the watch had remained silent. Its face a dark, unblinking eye, its hands frozen at the moment the city was saved. It was a relic, a memory, a constant reminder of the day the universe had whispered its secrets in his ear. Until now. It was the evening of April 9, 1912. Croft was in his basement laboratory, the familiar scent of ozone and old paper hanging in the air. He was conducting a routine spectral analysis of the chronometer's casing when it happened. A low hum, almost imperceptible at first, emanated from the watch. The air grew cold, just as it had 4 years ago. Croft's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched, mesmerized, as the hands of the chronometer, for the first time in 4 years, began to move. They spun, not wildly as before, but with a slow, deliberate purpose, as if charting a course through the vast, dark ocean of time. Then the visions came, not on the obsidian face of the watch, but in his mind, projected with a terrifying clarity. He did not see fire, but ice, a mountain of it, ghostly white under a star-dusted sky. He saw a ship, a behemoth of steel and rivets, the grandest vessel he had ever imagined, its lights blazing like a constellation fallen to earth. He saw the name on its bow, picked out in elegant gold letters, Titanic. He saw people dancing in opulent ballrooms, their laughter echoing over the strains of a string quartet. He saw stokers, their faces slick with sweat, feeding the ravenous furnaces deep in the ship's belly. And then he saw the collision, a silent, grinding impact, a shudder that ran the length of the magnificent ship. He saw the water, black and lethally cold, pouring into the vessel's heart. He saw chaos, fear, and a desperate and futile bravery. He saw a date, seared into his consciousness like a brand, April 14th, 1912. And he saw a number, more than 1,500 souls, lost to the unforgiving depths of the North Atlantic. The vision faded, leaving Croft gasping for breath, his body drenched in a cold sweat. He stumbled back from the workbench, his hand clutching his chest. The chronometer was silent again, its hands once more frozen in their resting place, but the hum of its warning still vibrated in the very marrow of his bones. He knew what he had to do. The world had moved on, and so had they, but time, it seemed, was not finished with them yet. He reached for his telephone,
his hand trembling as he asked the operator to connect him to the office of Mr. Silas Blackwood, private investigator. The alliance, forged in fire, would have to be reforged in ice. Silas arrived first, his sharp suit and confident stride a stark contrast to the frantic energy emanating from the professor. He found Croft pacing his study, a wild, haunted look in his eyes. "Professor," Silas began, a note of concern in his voice, "your call sounded urgent. Is everything all right?" Before Croft could answer, Nellie Bly was ushered in by the professor's housekeeper. She looked as formidable as ever, her gaze sharp and analytical. "Julian, what's happened? You sounded like you'd seen a ghost." Croft locked the study doors and drew the heavy velvet curtains, plunging the room into a dim, conspiratorial twilight. "Not a ghost, Nellie," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Something far, far worse." He led them down to his basement laboratory, the air thick with the unspoken memories of their last shared crisis. There, on the workbench, sat the chronometer. "It spoke," Croft said, simply, his words hanging in the silent air. "After 4 years of silence, it showed me a vision." Silas and Nellie exchanged the skeptical glance. They had all tried to move on, to rationalize the events of 1908 as a one-time anomaly, a moment of collective madness guided by a brilliant, if eccentric, old man. To revisit that world was to open a door they had all agreed was better left shut. "A vision of what?" Nellie asked, her journalistic instincts beginning to stir despite her reservations. Croft recounted what he had seen: the colossal ship, the iceberg, the date, the catastrophic loss of life. He told the name, the Titanic. The name was on everyone's lips, the R.M.S. Titanic, the White Star Line's new marvel of engineering, the unsinkable ship. It was due to set sail on its maiden voyage from Southampton the very next day, April 10th. It was the biggest news story in the world. "You're saying this ship, the biggest, safest ship ever built, is going to sink on its first voyage?" Silas asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "The chronometer has never been wrong," Croft insisted. "It showed me the fire, and it was real. Now it's showing me this." Nellie, ever the pragmatist, began to pace the laboratory floor. "All right, let's say we believe you, Julian. Let's say this is real. What can we possibly do? Go to the newspapers? Famous journalist claims magic watch predicts disaster? They'd lock me up. Warn the White Star Line? They'd laugh us out of their offices. We have no proof, nothing but a prophecy." "We need a foothold," Silas said, his mind already sifting through the angles, the possibilities. "A concrete reason to stop that ship, or at least to get someone in authority to listen. We can't fight a prophecy, but we can fight a man." "What are you suggesting?" Croft asked. "The Serpent's hand," Silas replied, the name casting a chill over the room. "My uncle is in prison, but he wasn't the entire organization. We never caught them all. What if this isn't an accident? What if it's an act of sabotage? What if one of them is on that ship?" It was a leap of faith, a shot in the dark, but it was the only tangible thread they had. An act of God was impossible to fight, but a conspiracy was something they could unravel.
Nellie's eyes lit up. This was a story she could sink her teeth into. "The passenger list," she said, her voice quickening. "It's been published. We need to go through it name by name, cross-reference it with everything we know about the Serpent's hand, their associates, their businesses." The team was back in motion. The hunt had begun again. They decamped to Nellie's office at the New York World, its walls plastered with headlines and photographs, a nerve center of information. With the city humming around them, they pored over the Titanic's first-class passenger list, a veritable who's who of the world's wealthiest and most powerful individuals: John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore and Ida Strauss. For hours they found nothing. The names were of impeccable repute. Their hope began to wane. Perhaps Croft's vision was just that, a hallucination brought on by years of obsessing over the chronometer. Then Silas saw it, a name that was not famous, not titled, but one that made his blood run cold. Mr. Alastair Templeton. It was an alias, he knew it instantly, an alias used by his uncle's most trusted and ruthless lieutenant, a man who had vanished without a trace after the events of 1908, a British explosives expert and fanatical devotee to the cause of creative destruction named Marcus Thorne. "I've got him," Silas whispered, his finger tracing the name on the passenger list. Marcus Thorne. He was my uncle's right hand, a ghost. No one's seen him in 4 years. What would he be doing on the Titanic? Nellie wondered aloud. The ship is a symbol, Croft mused, piecing it together. It represents the pinnacle of this era's technology, its hubris, its belief in its own invincibility. To bring it down, it would be the ultimate act of creative destruction. It would send a message to the entire world that nothing is safe, that man's greatest achievements are nothing but monuments to his own arrogance. They now had their tangible threat. A known terrorist was on board the world's most famous ship, but time was already slipping through their fingers. The Titanic was set to sail from England in less than 24 hours. Getting Thorne removed would require proof, and they had none beyond Silas's word and a vision from a mystical pocket watch. "We can't stop the sailing," Nellie said, her mind racing, "but we can get someone on that ship." "Who?" Silas asked. Nellie looked at him with a determined glint in her eye. "You, Silas. You're a master of disguise and infiltration. Thorne knows you, but he doesn't know what you look like now, not after 4 years. The ship makes a stop in Queenstown, Ireland, before it heads across the Atlantic. It's our last chance to get you aboard." It was a mad, desperate plan. Silas would have to assume a new identity, book passage on the most famous ship in the world, and once aboard, find a way to locate Thorne, discover his plan, and stop him, all while surrounded by 2,200 other passengers and crew in the middle of the ocean. "And how am I supposed to stop an expert in explosives on a ship I've never set foot on?" asked Silas, the enormity of the task sinking in. Croft stepped forward with a grim look on his face. "You won't be alone," he said. He opened his briefcase and produced a set of schematics. "I've been in contact with a colleague at the Harland and Wolff shipyards in Belfast under the guise of academic research. These are the complete blueprints for the R.M.S. Titanic." Then he pulled out a small, custom-made leather toolkit. "And I've been working on a few devices. Non-lethal, of course. Designed for disruption and detection. They may prove useful." The team was now set into motion. The Silas would travel to Ireland on the fastest ship available and, once aboard, find a way to locate Thorne, discover his plan, and stop him, all while surrounded by 2,200 other passengers and crew in the middle of the ocean in the icy waters of the North Atlantic.
The transatlantic crossing from New York to Queenstown was a blur of churning steam, salt spray, and coded telegrams. Silas Blackwood, now transformed into Sean O'Malley, a wiry Irish-American with a passable brogue and the worn, hopeful look of a man returning to the land of his ancestors before making his fortune in the New World, felt the crushing weight of his deception. Every coded message tapped out by the ship's wireless operator was a gamble. Aunt Millie's health failing. Doctors predict a turn by Sunday, he sent to a post office box in New York, a grim message for Nellie and Croft that the timeline was firm. The reply came back hours later. Uncle Thaddeus sends his regards from his country estate, recommends a thorough inspection of the wine cellar upon your arrival. It was Croft's confirmation relayed by Nellie. Thorne was almost certainly targeting the ship's structural integrity from its lowest levels. On the morning of April 11, 1912, Silas stood on the deck of the tender ship, the SS America, chugging out into the vast gray expanse of Queenstown Harbor. And then he saw it. The R.M.S. Titanic was not a ship. It was a floating mountain range, a sovereign nation of steel and ambition.
Its 4 colossal funnels, canted at a graceful angle, seemed to hold up the sky. The sheer scale of it was an act of defiance against the natural world, and for a moment Silas felt a pang of despair. How could one man, armed with a few custom-made gadgets and a terrible secret, hope to make a difference in a world this vast? He was herded aboard with 120 other third-class passengers, a chaotic river of humanity flowing into the ship's cavernous hull. The contrast was dizzying. Above, on the first-class promenade decks, he caught glimpses of men in tailored suits and women in extravagant hats, sipping champagne as they watched the Irish coastline recede. Down here, in the warren of whitewashed steel corridors known as steerage, the air was thick with the smell of boiled cabbage, cheap tobacco, and the electric tang of hope. Families huddled together on wooden benches, their life's possessions crammed into battered trunks, their faces a mixture of sorrow for the home they were leaving and boundless optimism for the life that awaited them in America. It was here that he met Aoife O'Connell. She was a young woman, no more than 20, with fiery red hair and eyes the color of the Irish Sea. She was trying to comfort her 2 younger brothers who were weeping for the dog they had to leave behind. Silas, seeing a flicker of his own long-lost sister in her determined expression, offered the boys a piece of hard candy. "They say even the streets are paved with gold in New York. Is it true, Mr. O'Malley?" "Not all of them, but there's gold to be found if you know where to look." In that moment, the 1,500 souls from Croft's vision ceased to be a number. They became Aoife and her brothers. They became the stern-faced Russian farmer, the boisterous Italian family, the quiet Scandinavian tailor. They were the lifeblood of the ship, and Silas felt a fierce, protective surge he hadn't known he was capable of. For the first 2 days, Silas was a ghost. He kept to himself, meticulously studying the blueprints Croft had provided, which he had painstakingly transferred onto thin sheets of rice paper hidden in the lining of his coat. He learned the ship's geography, the labyrinthine boiler rooms, the miles of service corridors, the locations of the watertight doors. He learned its rhythms, the changing of the watch, the meal times, the routes of the stewards. His third-class ticket was a cage, confining him to the stern of the ship. To get to the first-class sections where Marcus Thorne, a.k.a. Alastair Templeton, would be residing, he would have to become invisible. He used his old skills, the subtle arts of the Grifter. A purloined steward's jacket gave him access to the service corridors. A misplaced delivery order allowed him to wander the pristine hallways of the first-class decks. He saw the grand staircase, crowned with its cherub-adorned clock, and the shimmering opulence of the Café Parisien. It was another world, a world of effortless luxury, and somewhere within it his prey was hiding. He needed to make a message to Croft. Thorne was a phantom and Silas was running blind. He needed more information. Using one of Croft's cleverer devices, a small magnetic resonator that could disrupt telegraph signals just enough to create a momentary opening, he managed to get an uncensored message out through a bribed Marconi operator. Need description of Uncle's wine, vintage and region. The reply came back the next day. April 13th, vintage is aggressive, explosive, from the German school. Look for signs of tampering in the cellar. The message was clear. Croft suspected Thorne was using a sophisticated barometric trigger, a device that would detonate based on changes in pressure as the ship consumed coal and its weight distribution shifted. The targets would be the coal bunkers, adjacent to the boiler rooms and pressing against the ship's outer hull. A series of synchronized explosions there would rip the ship open like a tin can. That evening, Silas, disguised as a coal-dusted stoker, descended into the belly of the beast. The heat was hellish, a roaring, suffocating inferno. The air was thick with coal dust that clogged his throat and stung his eyes. Here, deep in the ship's guts, men worked in a relentless, punishing rhythm, their bodies glistening with sweat as they fed the Titanic's insatiable hunger for power. It was the perfect hiding place for an act of sabotage. He moved through the shadows of the massive coal bunkers, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. He found it in bunker number 6. Tucked away behind a pile of loose coal was a small canvas-wrapped package. His heart pounded. He carefully unwrapped it. Inside was not a bomb, but a timer, its hands ticking silently. It was a decoy, a trap. A floorboard creaked behind him. Silas spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for the weighted cosh in his pocket. A figure emerged from the shadows. He was a tall, impeccably dressed man in a first-class dinner suit. His signet ring, a serpent devouring its own tail, gleamed on his finger. It was Marcus Thorne. "Looking for something, Mr. Blackwood?" asked Thorne, his voice a cultured, chilling whisper that cut through the roar of the furnaces. He held a small, silver-plated pistol, its muzzle pointed directly at Silas's heart. His blood ran cold. His cover was blown. He was trapped miles from land in the fiery heart of a doomed ship, face to face with the man who was about to send it to the bottom of the ocean. The time for stealth was over. The fight for the Titanic had begun.
"Your uncle was a visionary," Thorne continued, his voice calm and steady despite the roar of the furnaces. He took a deliberate step closer, the pistol unwavering. He saw the rot at the core of this self-satisfied world, this monument to arrogance. He gestured with his free hand to the steel walls around them, is the perfect symbol of it all. An unsinkable ship filled with the untouchable rich, a monument that must be brought down as a lesson to the world. Silas's mind raced, his senses on high alert. He had to keep Thorne talking. He had to find an angle. And what happens to the hundreds of people in steerage, the families with children? Are they part of the lesson too? He asked, his voice dripping with contempt. Thorne smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. A necessary sacrifice. The serpent eats its own tail to be reborn. For a new world to rise, the old must be purged in fire, or, in this case, the iciest of water. He nudged the decoy bomb with the toe of his immaculate leather shoe. I knew you, or someone like you, would come sniffing around. This little bauble was simply the cheese in the trap. The real work is far more elegant. This was it, the moment Silas had been playing for. And what is that? Going to bore a hole in the hull? Thorne chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Crude, so very crude. No, Mr. Blackwood. The beauty of this plan is its subtlety. The ship will provide its own wound. The North Atlantic is filled with ice this time of year. Accidents happen. All it takes is one miscalculation, one moment of inattention. And when that moment comes, when the captain and his crew are scrambling to contain the damage, my devices will detonate. Devices? Silas pressed, his eyes darting around the bunker, looking for any advantage, any weapon. On the control mechanisms for the watertight doors, Thorne said, his pride evident. 6 of them, placed along the ship's keel. When the order is given to seal the compartments, the resulting electrical surge will trigger the charges. The very system designed to save the ship will instead ensure its demise, ripping out its spine and leaving it helpless. It will sink in minutes, not hours. No time for lifeboats, no time for rescue. A clean, decisive end. The sheer evil of the plan was breathtaking. It was a fail-safe, a way to guarantee the prophecy even if the ship only suffered a minor injury. Silas knew he was out of time. He subtly shifted his weight, his fingers brushing against the lining of his jacket where Croft's device lay waiting. It was a small, flat disc the professor had called the disruptor. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Silas said, forcing a note of grudging admiration into his voice. "Everything," Thorne confirmed. "Except me."
In one fluid motion, Silas palmed the disruptor and slammed his thumb down on its activation stud. The device didn't explode. It emitted a piercing high-frequency shriek that vibrated through the steel deck and a flash of blinding, white-hot magnesium light. Thorne cried out, instinctively raising a hand to shield his eyes, his ears ringing from the sonic assault. For a fraction of a second, he was disoriented. It was the only opening Silas would get. He lunged forward, not at Thorne, but at the massive grease-slicked lever that controlled the flow of coal from the bunker onto the conveyor belt to the furnaces. He threw his entire body weight against it. With a groan of protesting metal, the chute door opened. An avalanche of black coal surged out, a dusty, roaring torrent. Thorne, caught off balance, was knocked from his feet, the pistol flying from his grasp and skittering into the darkness. Silas scrambled for the weapon, his hands patting frantically in the thick dust. But Thorne was faster. He recovered with the speed of a predator, tackling Silas and driving him hard against the steel wall. The air was knocked from Silas's lungs. Thorne was wiry but deceptively strong, his fingers like iron claws as they closed around Silas's throat. "You will not ruin this," Thorne snarled, his face inches from Silas's, his eyes burning with fanaticism. Silas, gasping for air, slammed the heel of his palm into Thorne's nose. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage, and Thorne recoiled with a cry of pain, his grip loosening. Silas shoved him back and scrambled away, back towards the service corridor. He could hear the sound of shouting and approaching footsteps. The commotion had attracted attention. He found the pistol, its metal cool against his sweaty palm, just as Thorne lunged again. Silas didn't shoot. He couldn't risk the sound. Instead, he swung the heavy weapon like a club, catching Thorne squarely on the temple. Thorne's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious amidst the spreading pile of coal. He didn't wait to see if anyone found him. He was a ghost again, melting back into the shadows of the service corridors, his heart hammering in his chest, his mind racing. He was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. The entire ship's crew would be on alert for a saboteur. And somewhere, on the pristine upper decks, the orchestra was likely playing a waltz, the passengers blissfully unaware of the silent, desperate war being waged in the ship's steel heart. He flattened himself in an alcove as two burly engineers ran past, shouting about a disturbance in the boiler room. He pulled out his rice paper blueprints, his hands trembling. The watertight door controls. 6 of them, spread out over 300 yards of the ship's lowest deck, and he had to disarm them all, alone, while being hunted. He looked at his watch. It was nearing midnight, April 14th, 1912, the date from Croft's vision. The Titanic sailed on, a majestic jewel box on a black velvet sea, racing towards its appointment with a mountain of ice, and deep inside it, Silas Blackwood began his own race, against the ship's crew, against a madman's legacy, and against the unyielding hand of time itself.
The lowest level of a transatlantic liner is a world unto itself. It is a cold, damp steel labyrinth, a place of echoing noises, the constant deep thrum of the engines, the groaning of the ship's frame, the hiss of steam from 1,000 pipes. For Silas Blackwood, it became his hunting ground. He moved with a grim purpose, the blueprints a map etched in his memory. He found the first of Thorne's devices, strapped to the hydraulic control mechanism of the watertight door behind Boiler Room 6. It was a sophisticated piece of work, a pressure-sensitive trigger linked to a small, potent charge of dynamite. It was designed not to be found. But Croft's tuition had been thorough. Using a set of insulated pliers and a steady hand that belied the frantic pounding of his heart, Silas snipped the wires to the detonator, rendering the device inert. 1 down, 5 to go. He disarmed the second and third devices in the same nerve-wracking fashion, working his way forward, moving through the cavernous holds and baggage compartments. He was a phantom in the ship's bowels. twice having to press himself into the shadows as crewmen hurried past on their rounds, their faces etched with a vague unease, as if they could sense the ship's sickness but not name it. He was reaching for the fourth device, located near the forward cargo hold, when it happened. It was not a crash. There was no violent impact or sound of rending metal. It was a shudder, a deep, guttural, grinding vibration that ran the entire length of the ship's keel, as if a giant's fingernail were being scraped along its hull. The steady thrum of the engines died, and in their place came an unnatural, terrifying silence, broken only by the distant, panicked shouting of men. Then a new sound, the steady, insistent clang of alarm bells from the bridge. Silas's blood turned to ice. It had begun. The date from the vision, the mountain of ice. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, what order would come next. As if on cue, a loud klaxon horn blared through the lower decks, the signal to seal the ship. The order had been given. The electrical surge Thorn had planned for was now coursing through the ship's veins. He was out of time. He abandoned stealth and ran, his footsteps echoing on the metal gangways. He reached the fifth control box and ripped the cover off, his fingers fumbling with the wires. The device was live, a small light blinking ominously. He snipped the final wire just as he heard the groaning of the massive watertight door beginning to descend 100 feet behind him. 4 down, 1 to go. The final device was in the forepeak, the very nose of the ship, the place that would have taken the brunt of the impact. The corridor was already tilting at a noticeable angle, and a slick of frigid seawater was creeping across the floor. He could hear it now, the sound of the Atlantic Ocean pouring into the ship's wound. He saw the final control box, and standing before it, silhouetted against the dim emergency light, was Marcus Thorn. His face was a mask of blood from his broken nose, his suit was torn, and in his hand he gripped a heavy steel wrench. "It seems fate has a flair for the dramatic, Mr. Blackwood," Thorn hissed, his voice raspy. "You cannot stop it. The Serpent will have its due." He lunged, swinging the wrench in a deadly arc. Silas dodged, the wrench sparking against the steel bulkhead where his head had been moments before. The space was cramped, the floor slick with icy water that was now ankle-deep. They fought with a desperate, primal ferocity. Silas was faster, but Thorn was fueled by a madman's conviction. Silas landed a punch that sent Thorn staggering back, then threw himself at the bomb. He had the cover off, his pliers ready, when Thorn tackled him, driving him into the rising water. "The world needs to be cleansed," Thorn screamed, his hands closing around Silas's throat again, pushing his head under the surface. Silas's lungs burned. His vision began to blur. Thrashing wildly, his hand found the discarded wrench. With the last of his strength, he swung it, catching Thorn in the side of the head. Thorn's grip went slack, and he slumped into the water, his body limp. Silas gasped for air, scrambling back to the device. The water was now at his knees. He could hear the grinding of the final watertight door beginning its descent, just feet away, sealing the compartment. He had seconds. He found the correct wires, and with a final desperate snip, the blinking light on the device went dark. He had done it. He had stopped Thorn's plan. The ship would not be torn apart from the inside. But as the colossal wall of steel slammed shut with a deafening finality, sealing him in the flooding forward compartment, Silas knew he had only traded one fate for another. He had bought the ship precious hours, but he had spent all of his own. As the icy water rose around him, Silas Blackwood, the grifter who had become a savior, felt a strange sense of peace. He thought of Nellie and Croft, of the mad old clockmaker Alistair Finch. He thought of Afy O'Connell and her brothers, and the hundreds of others in steerage. He had given them a chance.
In the darkness, with the groans of the dying ship his only companion, he finally understood. He hadn't cheated fate, he had faced it, and in doing so had redeemed a lifetime of running away. In New York, Nellie Bly and Professor Julian Croft kept a grim vigil in the wireless room of the New York World. The first reports were garbled, confused. The Titanic, the unsinkable ship, had struck an iceberg. It was in distress. Then, for hours, an agonizing silence. Finally, the news came, and it was devastating. The R.M.S. Titanic had sunk. But as the first lists of survivors began to tick across the wire from the rescue ship, the Carpathia, a strange pattern emerged. Croft, his face pale, did the calculations. The vision had shown over 1,500 dead. The initial reports, while horrific, were showing something different. The final tally would be just over 700 survivors. A terrible tragedy, but not the apocalyptic loss of life the chronometer had foretold. 800 people who should have died had lived. They never heard from Silas again. He was listed among the missing, another nameless victim of the sea. They were the only two people on Earth who knew he was a hero. Weeks later, a letter arrived at Nellie's office. It was postmarked from a tenement building in the Lower East Side. The handwriting was simple, the English still learning. Dear Miss Bly, you do not know me, but my name is Afy O'Connell. I read your newspaper. I was a passenger in steerage on the Titanic. When the ship was sinking, there was much panic, but a kind American stranger, a man named Sean O'Malley, he was calm. He knew the ship. He knew the way out. He led my brothers and me and many others up from the lower decks to the boats. He did not get in a boat himself. He said there were more people to help. I never saw him again. I do not know if he lived, but my brothers and I are alive because of him. I thought someone should know. Nellie wept as she read the letter aloud to Croft in his study. She placed it on the workbench beside the chronometer, which was once again silent, its hands frozen. He did it, Julian, she whispered. He bought them enough time. The ship stayed afloat long enough for the lifeboats to be launched, for the Carpathia to arrive. Croft looked at the silent watch, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. We were wrong, he said softly. We thought its purpose was to change time. But it's not. Time is a river. You cannot stop its flow. But you can throw a stone into it. You can create a ripple, change the current in small, meaningful ways. We couldn't stop the ship from sinking. That was its destiny. But Silas saved the passengers. He didn't cheat fate. He just negotiated a better deal. The alliance was over. Their race against time was finished. They were left with a shared secret, a silent victory, and the memory of a friend who had been lost in the icy depths of the Atlantic. The world would remember the Titanic as a tragedy, a story of hubris and ice, but Nellie and Croft would forever know the truth, that it was also the story of a mad clockmaker, a brilliant professor, a fearless journalist, and a silver-tongued grifter who, against all odds, reached into the heart of a prophecy and saved 800 souls from the unsparing hand of fate.